June, and has come out to talk about her experiences as an aviator, instructor, master mechanic, Charles Taylor, master mechanic, somebody who's taken apart engines. Here's an extremely charming, beautiful young woman, 1943, you could pass it around. That's Mary, and I'm going to embarrass you. She's on the wing of her Mustang that she was required to take apart, put back together at Wright Field in Dayton, and ultimately that served as kind of the training for her to eventually create a captive air, is that how you say it? A PAE trainer during the transition from prop to jet engines. So she has so many awards, so much expertise, 6,000 hours in World War II aircraft, including 400 hours in P-47s. And unlike many fighter pilots that we've had here, she could actually articulate and tell you what it was like to fly the trim tabs, how the engines, the torque, you name it. So she's the real deal and has contributed so much to education. Most recently, she's been involved in Civil Air Patrol, as well as be receiving the Brewer Award for an educator in aerospace. She's just an inspiration for a lot of kids. But she'll talk today, I don't know what she's going to talk about, but it's somebody from the war years who was there, who experienced in a man's world, taking engines apart, putting them back together. She has a firm grip, so we'll probe her and find out about the aircraft's characteristics or whatever you want, but I'm going to turn it over to her. Sorry for a little delay. Mary has a slideshow. We're doing for a treat, just an outstanding person. So, Mary Feik, please let's give her a warm welcome. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's always so much fun to greet an audience. And when I give a presentation, for me it's like hanger flying. Whenever any pilots get together or any veterans get together, we sit down, if it's at lunch or coffee or whatever it is, and we hanger fly. We tell about all of our experiences and the fun we had. And I guess I was one of the luckier people in World War II. I overhauled my first engine for my father in his automobile repair shop when I was 13 years old. And I did all of his welding when I was 11 years old. And how could I do that? He taught me how. So what I'm going to give you is a little bit of an overview, if you will, of some of the projects. It's very difficult oftentimes if you're designing equipment and you don't have something to show, to try to do it verbally. It does not conjure up an image in most people's faces. Say, for instance, what is a P-51 captive air? What does it look like? What does it do? So what I'm going to try to do is to give you some idea of what happened to me. Now, I got through high school in 3 years instead of 4 because I took a lot of extra work, extra exams. And I got out of school with an equivalent 4.0 average. I went to the University of Buffalo, wanted to get into the engineering school. And the registrar took one look at me and said, I'm sorry, we don't take women because you can't handle the work. That was in 1941, late 41. So I came home crying because I didn't know what my fallback position was going to be. But my father decided to get a job for me, and that was teaching aircraft maintenance in the U.S. Army Air Corps at Seymour Johnson Field. Now, I hated to leave my dad, but he told me that if I didn't leave this smelly, dirty, run-down mill town, that I would be sorry. So, the last words that my dad said to me as I was getting into my car, and incidentally, I needed A stamps. I needed gasoline stamps. And all the men for whom we repaired automobiles, because they were fathers, they needed to work, gave me their stamps. So I know there were a lot of fathers that walked to work just to give me a chance to get down to the Carolinas. So it was aircraft maintenance. And that opened up an entire world to me that in a mill town during the Depression years. Nobody ever dreamed that they would fly an airplane or even get near one. So this was a fallback position that opened up a whole new world for me. But I think that what I'm trying to say is that because of my experience as being the only woman doing this and doing that and something else, working solely with men, that I must have had a hard time. I guarantee I did not have a hard time. The men with whom I worked became my buddies and my sweethearts, and we worked together, had a mission to accomplish. We worked together and we got the job done. Well, my job was training. Maintenance training got to be a little pricey. We didn't have anything with which to work. So I applied to Wright Field, and I was the first woman that actually they called me a girl. I was 18 years old, and they simply called, this was the first girl that they ever hired up there in RD. So I got a job after my angel, my boss said, oh hell, I'll take her because nobody knew what to do with me. And he gave me the job of fighter pilot transition training and maintenance training. And the first thing he said to me, Mary, we're going to have to teach you how to fly. So he recruited 5 military instructor pilots, and on their own time, they taught this teenage girl who was civilian how to fly. And those of you that have flown Stearmans and BTs and T6s, well, my next job was learning to fly a P-51. And I can only tell you, before I could do the trainer, I sat in the cockpit, and my instructor belted me in, and I was totally euphoric. I said, oh my gosh, they're really going to let me fly this Portugal airplane. And then suddenly the reality began to set in, and I remember saying to myself, don't screw it up. So my instructor said, okay, Mary, she's all yours, go fly. Now, Bob Hoover, most of you know, who was a pilot for Rockwell, he was a captain down there at Base Ops, as was Gabby Gabrowski and Chuck Yeager and Richard Bond. I mean, they were all flying out of the same place. And he was the one that gave me my talk through. So I did qualify then in the P-51, and then I could qualify myself to design a trainer around, a simulator trainer around a real airplane. But before that, I just want to give you an insight into what women were really doing and some of the misapprehensions that we had. So I'm hoping that we can get some douse light here a little bit. It's maybe a little hard to see. Now, this is the current image for Rosie the Riveter. The only lady I ever saw in a production plant that had muscles like that was a gal in Bell Aircraft who had took out 37 millimeter cannons out of the cosmoline and dumped them into degreasing vats. And she did this all day long. She would have been the best at a wrestling match that you had ever seen. However, this was my Rosie. These were the beautiful ladies that for the first time in their lives, they got a chance to get out of the house, out of the kitchen, out of the laundry room, and do something for the war effort. Unfortunately, when the war was over, the men came back from war, took over their own jobs, the ladies were told to go home, and they were not even given a thank you, which I think is regrettable even to the government today. But this was a poster done by the federal government, and I guarantee this is what 99% of the Rosies look like. I was an instructor down in Seymour Johnson. I had nothing with which to teach. I used to spend time in the in the garage in the hangar trying to do cutaways, system trainers, and I said, oh God, there's got to be a better way. So I applied then to Wright Field. I was a teenager, never died though. I just wrote to them and I said, this is where I am, this is what I'm trying to do, there's got to be a better way. And 2 days later they sent me a telegram and hired me up there. I always enjoyed this certificate because my boss had to go back and get it for me, but this is the fundamentals of teaching and mechanics and so forth. But I can always say I belonged to the Army at one time. 19 years old, I'd already checked out in the P-51, and let me tell you, this little old P-51C was a run-out, rag-down airplane. And if you ever wanted to see somebody getting excited about signing a property slip for one each P-51, you're looking at her. I had to take this airplane, put it up on pylons, if you will, because the landing gear had to come up, the engine had to run, and what we were trying to do is create cockpit instrument, shall we say, problems that the pilot had to solve. This was a real-life trainer, but it had to be a fire-breathing one. So this P-51, I was told by the Army, had to go back into flying condition by 1 week. So everything I did with this airplane meant that I had to put it back in flying condition by myself in 1 week, which I was able to do. And I flew it and gave it back. But to do that, this is a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. I had to be sure to support the front part of the airplane because when you start an airplane and it's tied down, the nose ducks down because it wants to go. And if it's tied down, that happens. Well, I couldn't afford to have that happen here, and I couldn't afford the torsional stresses on the wings. So I had this concrete pylon and a cap over it with a lot of padding to be sure that nothing happened to the wing. Since I had to put it back in flying condition, I only had one hole in the entire fuselage. This was the line that went underground to a control house, and there were 2 lines for the coolant in the engine and the oil to be sure that I had it properly cooled. Let me tell you, in today's world, when I look back at vacuum tubes and hard wiring, I would have given my soul for a transistor, I guarantee it. I want you to look at the auxiliary power unit. This is what you use to start the airplane up. Well, I have a lawnmower at home that's engine driven that has more horsepower than that APU. But you can see where the particular support there at the firewall was able to support that part of the airplane. All right, there's a hole called the hoist tube through the fuselage of the airplane, and that was used in cargo. If they had to take the fuselage of the airplane to ship it on board a ship, they could always put a rod through there and use it as a hoist. Well, I didn't put any extra holes in there, but this is my cooling tower. This is for the ethylene glycol, this is for the oil. And I didn't guess on anything. I decided that I better get some expert ideas, so I went down to the engine experimental lab on the field, and the engineers told me exactly what I needed to do. However, being a welder at the age of 11, I constructed this entire tower. Now, the man that you see there is from Rolls-Royce in England. The word got to England, Rolls-Royce Company, that there was a girl at Wright Field that was going to do unspeakable things to their engine, and there was a danger that I would ruin corporate image. So they sent Mr. Walters. So he and I went over through the whole thing, and my boss said to me that he overheard the telephone conversation to England, and what Mr. Walters says, not to worry, she knows what she was doing. So I got that, okay, but there I am doing the explanation. This is essentially the captive air, this is the engine running, this is the instructor pilot, and you can see that the wheels are retracted. We have instruments that can be altered in the cockpit. The instructor pilot can get the engine torn down or shut down, and he could raise all of the everything in the cockpit to create an emergency. So this worked out for 6 pilots that were second lieutenants, went from T6s to 51s, went down to the flight line, and again, they were given their talk through in the P-51. And my friend Bill Geyer, the first young cadet that I put through, was able to do a victory roll down the runway because he was told he was good enough. All right, during the war years, if you had to let a contract to have a contractor build something, you could walk the contract through maybe in 6 months. So I had to come up. They needed these trainers desperately. So I told my boss that I would write an erection specification so that any base, if they had an airplane, they could make a captive air by my instructions in my table of materials. Now, my job was to go to every place that they had a captive air and do the acceptance testing, because all of these airplanes went back into flying condition. We wasted nothing because we couldn't afford to. We didn't have that kind of an inventory. All right, P-47, we were talking about that early. This has my favorite Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. All right, I'm making a captive air out of it. But how do I cool it? This is an air-cooled engine. Can I put a fan in front? That doesn't sound very practical. So what I did, I tried to destroy that engine. I ran it for 200 hours, mostly at full power, just watching the oil tank so it didn't get out of range. And I literally, in the desert of 113-degree heat during the day, literally tried to destroy it. After 200 hours, I took the engine out, tore it down, mic'd it, found there was nothing wearing there, but since I had it down, I did a top overhaul, put it back together, tested it on a test stand, and put it back in the airplane, and it flew. But that was the one big challenge, because the P-47 was one of the airplanes everybody wanted to fly. Now, this is the one we were talking about earlier, Dr. Charney. This is the old back, what we call the Razorback on the P-47, and this was made into a captive air very early on, and you can see the Army Air Force symbol with the star and the red dot in the thing. So this is one of my favorites. But you can see the gear is beginning to come up, the engine is running. I even had the audacity to do it with a P-38. These are 2 Allison V-1710 liquid cools, and the Air University used it as a feature in their Air University journal. And you can see that control house is very minimal, but this was not to be a permanent kind of operation, because when all of the students that needed to fly the P-38 were through, the P-38 went back into service. Oh, the B-29. You know, it just bothers me so much when you take an airplane and the only reason that people know what the B-29 is because it dropped the atomic bomb. Now, I can't imagine why you would ignore the wonderful design that went into this airplane. For as big as it was the first one that had a pressurized cabin. And in the tail section, where you had the gunner, that was also pressurized. And what you had to do is go through a tube to get from one end of the airplane to the other, pulling yourself through the tube on a wire. But it also had a 3-man deck. This is a pilot and a co-pilot and a flight engineer. So as my boss often said to me, I come in the morning, he said, "Mary, I want you to go to Boeing, I want you to check out as a B-29 flight engineer." So I got to Gabby Dabrowski, who said, "Yeah, I've got a P-17, so I flew a P-17, which is a Boeing airplane, to Boeing." When I got in the airplane, this is the instrument panel for the pilot. The co-pilot has one exactly the same. This was mine. When I got in there and I looked at my instrument panel, I said, gentlemen, this airplane belongs to me. Because I started the engines, I gave the pilot the degrees of flaps he wanted, I did all of it. All the pilot had to do was just, yell back 30 degrees of flaps or this, or whatever the engine settings that he wanted. But I did it all. So it was a challenging job to try to get a simulator to teach that station. So when I got back to Wright Field, I almost had a second career, shall we say, because if they were doing test flying in a B-29, they could get a pilot and co-pilot, but no flight engineer. So they'd call my boss, and my boss would say, well, how long is the flight? And then he would turn to me and say, fly dry, no coffee this morning. The flight is 12 hours long. Well, there's no bathroom facility for a girl on a B-29. So this is what I do, but I told John there was a lot of interaction between all three members, so I got to check out as a pilot in a B-29 also. Tony LaVere, I use this for my cadets. Tony LaVere was a pilot, a supreme pilot. He flew air races during the golden age before World War II, and when the war came along, he went to the Air Corps and said, I want to join up. Well, they said, we're sorry, you wear glasses, we can't take you. So then Tony went to Lockheed and flew as their premier test pilot. Everything that Lockheed built, he flew. So I tell the youngsters, if you don't get your first go, as I did not get my first go, have a fallback position. It could open up a whole new world for you. All right, the P-80 was our first airplane to go into the jet age. This is a jet fighter. We did have the P-59, which was a Bell aircraft twin engine fighter, but it really was more of an aerodynamic platform. The P-80 was our real first jet fighter. Well, I was talking to a test pilot there. I needed some data for my captive air. And somebody from the newspaper came by and saw me on the wing. And when he published it, he called the P-80 Mary's Little Lamb. Now, any place I went in this country, if there was a P-80 on the field, they never called it a P-80. They called it Mary's Little Lamb, which I thought was quite an honorable thing for them to do. All right, the cockpit. I got a brand new P-80 to use as a captive air. And what I did not know was how would it work at Williams Air Force Base out in the desert. Because if you overprime this airplane, you could melt the tail. And a lot of tails were melted that way. So I had this brand new airplane. I put thermocouples in the tailpipe so I could get thermal readings. I got into the cockpit, and my sergeant said to me, Mary, let's go out on the ramp to do this test at dawn. It's coolest then, there's nobody around, and we can just play around and find out what's going on. Well, when we got out there that morning at dawn, there were 200 people out on the ramp. They found out that this girl was going to fire up this airplane, and she was going to do one of two things. She was going to either kick the brakes and go flying, or she was going to blow the airplane up. Well, we did it. But I want you to know that this cockpit, this arrangement, I fly my little Piper Comanche. I have twice as many instruments in my cockpit than we had in this P-80. But you can see here I'm at 96% power. Everything went well, so it was a go for a captive air. This is my team. And ladies, wear that turban. It's not a fashion statement. This man, Sergeant Sprague, came in one morning with a silk white scarf. Now, here is the engine. You could adjust the engine when it was running from this hatch. No matter what I did with my hair, I always couldn't get it tight enough, and I used to get it caught in the intake screen. So he brought this white scarf and he said, Mary, I am tired of cutting your hair on the intake screen. I want you to wear this. So I did, And when the project was over, it was pure silk. I had it dry cleaned. I had it nicely packaged, and I tried to give it back to him. And he said, "Oh, I want you to keep it. It belonged to my uncle. He was a World War I fighter pilot. And this was his right scar." So needless to say, I have a treasure. This is what the captive air looks like. Here is one instrument panel. The instructor pilot is altering the instruments to give a reason for emergency. And over on this side, he has a reading, an instrument reading of exactly what is really happening with the airplane. So if anything were to go wrong, he would know immediately. But the student pilot, though, was up there getting really harassed, I think. This is what it looked like at Edwards, I shouldn't say Edwards, but at Williams Air Force Base. We had a lot of CO2 cylinders, because if you're overprimed, even with a captive air, you could burn the tail down. Captive Air class, Skyways magazine was a premier issue. And here we have, this is a J-33 engine, Allison engine, and I did that cutaway for this school. And down here we have the P-80, the P-51. We had about 5 different airplanes, all captive airs in a line. And here you can get another view of the P-8 captive air with the instructor pilot. But over here, it's interesting. We have a cadet that's going into the P-51. But notice in the back, there's an instructor pilot in a jump seat looking out. Now, presumably, this is not a two-place airplane. How did I possibly get enough weight reduction to put a man back there? It was pretty much because of one man who developed a rivet, a high-shear rivet. His name was George Seabrook Wing. And I don't know very many people in all of aviation that know who he is. But when he developed this rivet, and it was first used in P-51, it reduced the weight of the hardware in that airplane by 1/3. So there was enough weight saving that they put a range tank in the fuselage. That allowed the P-51 to escort the bombers deep into Germany, which no other fighter could do. So I was able to take the range tank out, 100 pounds of radio equipment, and I had enough room for an instructor pilot. Well, P-51s today are all two-place for that very same reason, thanks to George Seabrook Wing. My first inclination to help the Civil Air Patrol, and the greatest compliment I get from the cadets is, "Ma'am, when were you a cadet?" This was in the 40s, and I used to have some time off on weekends. This isn't a little Wonka Champ. It's a fabric-covered airplane, and since I knew a lot about fabric airplanes and maintenance, I used to volunteer to help them with their maintenance problems. Now, this beautifully handsome man sitting in a CAP airplane, most of you probably would not know looking at him, and maybe you might know Zach Mosley, who did the little Smiling Jack strip. Well, this is Zach Mosley. He used to do bay patrol on the East Coast when we were, in fact, the one airplane that he was flying is the one that dropped the bomb in the conning tower of the German sub. But this man did a lot for Civil Air Patrol, and here he is as a lieutenant colonel. Now, this is Smiling Jack, this is Zach, and taboo was something we always wished every pilot that was going to go flying. And I had one cadet last night that said she knew what it was. Clear air, visibility unlimited. In the early days, that you wished that to every pilot that was going flying. Now, the Jet T-33 is a jet trainer that sprung out of the P-80. Tony LeVere and I were sitting on the ramp at Williams Air Force Base, and we said, we've got to have a jet trainer. And so we were looking at the P-80, we found out that we took one of the stations and stretched it. We could put in a second cockpit. And he sold it to Lockheed, I sold it to Wright Field, and this is how we got the Tiger. And you can see this is what she looked like Now that's dual controls, and it is the primary fighter that is still flying all over the world, especially in South America. All right, Zach Mosley honored me by putting my captive air in his comic strip. This was Plain Facts, and Mr. Downwin here, if you could read his blurb, it said, and it was designed by a woman. So this is my P8 captive air and the honor I get to be in the funny paper. All right, this is Zach. He was a full colonel for Civil Air Patrol, and he is in the Wall of Honor at Maxwell Air Force Base is our headquarters. But the fact that he used to fly Bay Patrol looking for German subs, a lot of people didn't know that. But a lot of his cartoons encouraged young people to learn about flying, about the military, about what things were going on. And I'm really kind of sad that we don't have that anymore. At EAA convention, since I was a master mechanic, thanks to my sweethearts, my sergeants who got the certificate for me, here I am teaching a lady who came up to me. This is rib stitching on a fabric airplane. And she came up to me and said, how long would it take me to learn how to do this? And I looked at her and I said, 5 minutes. She said, well, my husband tells me that it's really hard. I said, okay, let's go try it. Not only did she learn in 5 minutes, but in 7 minutes she did the whole rib. So she stood back afterwards and she said, my husband and I are going to have a very serious discussion at dinner tonight. In Kansas City, there's a man in the antique organization that wanted to build a full-scale Fokker D7, a German airplane, from scratch. He asked me if I would help him do it by being the engineer on the job, and then he asked me how much I wanted in the way of pay. And I said, if you can recruit 6 youngsters from high school or the VOTEC school to help us build it, that's all the pay I want. So here's the beginning. Kids learned all about wood, welding, and the engine was an American engine because nobody can afford a Mercedes engine. But we took a Ranger engine and flipped it upside down so that we could get the propeller properly oriented, and the youngsters learned how to redo this engine, redo the oil system, everything. So they stayed with us for 2.5 years, all of them. This is what the airplane looked like when it was finished, and as far as I know, this is still flying today. Of course, with the single cockpit, the kids didn't get a chance to get a ride. In Kansas City also, the Air and Space Museum in '76 said that they wanted the first mail plane, all-metal mail plane, the Northrop Alpha, and the EAA had one that was rotting out in the weeds, and they were persuaded to give the airplane to the Air and Space Museum. Well, this is what we had in the way of parts, and when we flipped the wing over, we found TWA in great big letters. So we went to WWII, who had the restoration and the organization for restoring and modifying and maintaining airplanes. And so he said that he would give 2 employees, and the rest of us were volunteers, and we built this airplane for Air and Space. You can see here, as the airplane began to take shape, we also had a sister ship here. The fuselage and the center section were too rotted, didn't fit together. So NC-11 Yankee had enough so that we could get a good airplane out of it. So this is what she looked like as she was being assembled and restored. On the rollout of February '76, a little airplane came out. They rolled out an L-1011 from TWA, and we put the TWA symbol on the fuselage, CAM-18, contract airmail. But this airplane is unique in some interesting ways. First of all, there's an antenna mast. In 1930, the pilot could get weather reports on his mail route. Secondly, you notice there's some black rubber on the vertical fin. You'll find that on the leading edge of the horizontal stabilizer and the wings. This airplane had de-icer boots. We went to B.F. Goodrich and said, you know, we know this airplane had de-icer boots. Could you give us something that we can put on the airplane that would look like that? And the manager of B.F. Goodrich said, no, we'll make them work. So this airplane was built to airworthiness standards. It had an airworthiness certificate from the FAA, and if you hooked up the air to the engine, you would get pulsating de-icer boots. There she is down here in space in the commercial gallery, beautifully suspended, beautifully displayed. I was a docent at the Garber facility, Silver Hill, as most people know it, and I was persuaded to take a job there. And the men who worked there were the finest craftsmen I've ever seen, see the world, far mountain. And I thought, well, I had a 90-mile-a-day commute, but I thought that it would be wonderful to be able to work with them, so I took the job. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an airplane. This is 1910 Wiseman Cook, the first airplane in California to carry the airmail. Richard Horrigan and I got the job. First of all, we had to find out, did we have an airplane? So we put it all together. There were at least 3 gauges of baling wire, but you can see with the interplane ailerons that this was based on a Curtiss design. Well, there she is. This is Richard Horrigan and I. We did the airplane. It's hanging up in Washington, D.C. in the Postal Museum near the metro station. But this is all in linen. This is Irish linen, and the Hall-Scott engine is a piece of jewelry. The cylinders in 1903 were nickel-plated, and today, in today's world, if we want something plated, we don't use nickel, we use chrome. Well, chrome is not in existence. So we persuaded one shop in Virginia to do the cylinders for us, and literally, the engine looks like a piece of jewelry. Now, we're often accused that we try to make airplanes look too pretty. Our job was to preserve the technology, whatever it took. So what you have here is preserving the technology of 1903. Now, here we have a flight of SPAD 13s. This is an actual photograph taken during World War I. And I want you to look at the highlights on all of the fabric here. Now, these airplanes were in a war situation. They weren't made to look pretty. Ray Brooks, in fact, not too long ago in the series Dogfights on the History Channel, they did have a World War I dogfights in which Ray Brooks' airplane was actually featured, and it's the one that we restored. All right, here's Ray's airplane. Came into the collection in 1920, flying condition. It flew into Washington. It had 55 hours overtime since it was new. Secretary Abbott said, oh, aviation's not here to stay, and this is the way they wrecked it in storage. It should have been done 5 years earlier. So handsome Charlie Parmalee was a team chief leader. He and I are about the same age, same experience. He got the job, and he went in and asked for me to help with this restoration. Everybody in the shop wanted to do it, so I felt very honored that I was going to be a part of that. All the beautiful workmanship here. The airplane was actually built by a piano manufacturer in France, WWII, and every piece that was built by any of the craftsmen, they signed it. So we had 50 or more autographs that we preserved in this airplane as we put it back together. This is Ray Brooks. In later years, he used to come down and tell us all kinds of fantastic stories. This is the SPAD 13 in work. But he used to tell us, well, one of the things we asked him, you know, the World War I fighters had a tail skid and no brakes. And as you came into a wet field with wet grass, I said, Ray, how do you stop this airplane? Oh, he said, very simply, we head for the mess tent and they come out and stop us. And I found that verified by other World War I pilots. So we put the entire airplane together, be sure we had it all before we put the fabric on it. But I want you to notice the tires. These were real rubber tires. They were built by Michelin. And of course, in a matter of weeks, they deteriorated because they were not butyl tire or rubber. They were real rubber. In fact, when you opened the case, you could smell it. It was like erasers on a pencil. So we went to Michelin and said, would you make 2 sets of tires for us for a SPAD? And they said, yes, they would do it. And then, of course, we always had to ask how much. And they said $26,000 for the mold and labor and materials on that, but they decided to give it to us. But if you see the SPAD downtown in the Air and Space Museum, on the sidewalls in 1.5-inch letters you see Michelin. Well, you can't buy that kind of advertising, I guarantee. All right, fabric. We found out this was Belgian linen. And Charlie and I used to brainstorm in the morning and flip a coin to see which part of the airplane we were going to do. And he said, where are we going to get Belgian linen? Because the weight was about 4 times the weight of normal Irish linen, very, very heavy. So I told him, I said, the only place we can get that kind of linen is from the Hamilton Company in New York. They import fabric for oil paintings. And so we sent them a swatch of material. They came back and they said that they could match it precisely. So instead of 1 ounce per square yard, we had fabric that was 8 ounces per square yard, and we had to put it on the airplane very carefully from the shrinkage standpoint. But I want you to notice here there are a lot of little black dots. This airplane sustained 64 bullet holes, and each bullet hole had a little black patch on it with the Iron Cross. Well, we recreated all of those little patches over the airplane. These are the 46 little tombstones along the right lower longeron of the fuselage. And this was the kills for the squadron, the 20th Squadron during World War I. Now, you notice that everything, that little grass in between, a little shadow there to give depth. Well, we went to the art department and asked them if they would do this for our airplane, and they said, well, they're not going to do it in dope. They wanted to do it in paint. Well, paint on this kind of nitrate and butyrate dope, it would have fallen off in about 10 days. So Handsome said, okay, Mary, it's your job. So here's my beautiful SPAD, my 46 little tombstones. You can see a little bit of the patches. But I laid on my back on a cot for 10 solid days painting in butyrate dope these little tombstones. But that was part of it. Now, to have ultraviolet reflection, they put in a little bit of aluminum powder, but except for in the black. So if this airplane were to sit outside, the ultraviolet would destroy the black part of the skin. But the other thing that was interesting is that this entire airplane was hand brushed. They didn't have compressors and air guns in that era, so everything was hand done. And Oshkosh, I'm asked often to look at the home builds. Here we had the ultralight era, and there was a young man that came into the restoration center, and he wanted me to look at his airplane and give him some comments. So I went out, and there was this little airplane that had a bird-like wing. I said, that's a float. 2 little French Creek engines between the 2 of them. They had about 45 or 50 horsepower. And this was his fuel system. 2 Preston tanks. And I said, no, that's not going to work. Besides that, the fuselage was a 2x8. And I said to him, did you do a weight per ratio, per horsepower ratio on this airplane? And he said, no, should I? And I said, yes, that was number 1. So he and I, for the entire day, spent all the time. He was taking notes. I told him what he had to do. I'm not sure that he ever finished this airplane, but he was eager enough that he was going to build an airplane, no matter what. But we had more fun just for a whole day just talking airplane. Now, Bert Rutan, who unfortunately lost his his plant out at Edwards Air Force Base. I don't know what happened to Scale Composites, but he's lost his entire manufacturing plant. But here's a composite airplane, fiberglass and what have you. It's just a home built. This is a little quickie, and the biggest expense you'd have is the engine and the prop. It's labor intensive, but you want an airplane, you can build it. Here we have a Lance Air, 75th anniversary of Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. His grandson, Eric, duplicated or recreated that flight. He flew a Lance Air. This is a kid-built airplane. Now, Eric had all the GPS and everything else that his dad didn't have, but this gives you an idea. You build a slow airplane, you can go 300 miles an hour. It's not slow, and it's very economical. Again, you can buy it in various stages. You can do 300 miles an hour easily. And I say that nobody in the world we don't have to take a backseat to any manufacturer of airplanes in the world. We've got an airplane here for a pilot who doesn't know which way it's up. You can land this airplane upside down. This is my little Piper Pacer. She's covered in cotton. She is going up to the museum in Lock Haven, the Piper Museum. Because she's the last of 6 airplanes that were built like this. This is 1952. And I have 4 cadets that are helping me from Civil Air Patrol put it in condition, and we're going to donate it to the museum as a memorial to my husband because he really loved this little airplane. This is my Comanche. I talked about the instrument panel with P-80. And I bring this up because Florence Parlett was a lady that allowed us to have a Civil Air Patrol squadron at her airport, the airport. And she provided tie-down spaces. And this is where we fly Bay Patrol every weekend. And with the Coast Guard, we look to be sure that everybody on the bay is safe. But this is my little bird. I have a daughter and a son-in-law that keep it exercised when I can't fly it. But this is my pride and joy. And I'm still flying. At our airport, you can tell when an airplane doesn't get flown very much because they do spill their nest. All right, a young man I met in California who flew for the Navy. This is a Navy Tomcat. And I said to John, where did you get your first interest in aviation? Because here we have a Tomcat that is about to break the speed of sound, and you can see the wedging here. So I asked him, he gave me this picture, which is wonderful for the youngsters to see when you get to compressibility, all these compression wedges that you get in an airplane, which really causes a lot of stress. So an airplane has to be built to withstand it. He said his father built a pedal plane for him. Here we have the Curtis Pitts. This is an aerobatic airplane, and this is Curtis Pitts and her kittens. And you never know with youngsters what's going to turn them on. John is now working for the airlines. He went through the Navy, and now he works for the airlines. But this was his first flight. All right, the Air and Space Museum. We have the original Wright Flyer, 1903. It flew 120 feet. 66 years later, the Concorde flowed passengers twice the speed of sound. 66 years. I've been in maintenance 65 years. In my career span, conceivably, I could have seen the Wright brothers fly and have flown in the Concorde, which incidentally I did get a chance to fly in the jump seat in the cockpit for my 50th wedding anniversary present. But at any rate, but not only in 69, what else did we do? We sent a man to the moon. So when I'm talking to the youngsters, I said, look what happened in my lifetime. Not from the time I was born to the time I would die, but just my career span. Now, what is it you can do in your career life? Now, what are you going to be able to accomplish? Because it's doable, and you have so many options nowadays. But at any rate, this is what I think a lot of people don't understand. And also, in the Wright Flyer, Charles Taylor, master mechanic, there aren't many people who knew who Charles Taylor was. And I'll show you the certificate that was given to me. All right. Steve Canyon, Milton Connect. Remember, we used to have this in the funny papers all the time. You could read about aviation. You could read about the military. Do we have Milton Connect? Do we have Steve Canyon any longer? No. The last thing I remember, Calvin and Hobbes. Here's Calvin, and he's sitting in his cockpit, and he has the right message there. It is the insurance premiums that are pretty high. All right, here's the Charles Taylor Master Mechanic, and as far as I know, we're still investigating. I believe that I'm the first woman to get that. My sergeants got it for me. They flew from California to Washington, gave it to me as a surprise at a banquet. But who was Charles Taylor? Charles Taylor was the man that built the engine for the Wright brothers. Otherwise, there would not have been powered flight. And so the FAA decided in their infinite wisdom that maybe they ought to honor anybody who is a mechanic, but you have to be in maintenance for 50 years to even qualify. Well, I'm in my 65th right now. This is the start, shall we say, of my journal. I tell the youngsters that everything they accomplish and have fun with, write it down in a book, because it's something they can look back in their life when they get older. Here we have 4 fighters. I flew every one of them, and it was a one-shot deal out at Edwards Air Force Base. All these 4 airplanes took off together and made a bank return, and I grabbed this view of it. Here's the P-38, P-47, P-63 King Cobra, and the P-51. I flew every one of those airplanes. In fact, I have more than 400 hours in the P-51 alone. So I try to encourage the kids that they should find something they really want to do, get their basics, keep their journals, be proud of what they do, because as they get older, this is going to mean a lot to them as it does to me. So I'm very happy to be able to come here and talk to you, with you later, about my experiences, because my father, when I left, gave me 4 things to remember, since he knew I was going to work with men. And the first thing he said to me, Mary, I always want you to be a lady. Don't be one of the guys. And believe me, that works. We used to go into a base. I'd fly in, and we either refuel or something. Well, I had my flying clothes and everything else, and we'd go to either the oil club or the NCO club. I used to take my flying clothes off. I had a ditty bag with a dress and shoes, and of course nylon stockings when I could get them. They always took a lady to a lunch or a dinner, and they liked that. I liked it too. I had one lady say, why in hell did you do that for them? And I say, I didn't do it for them. I did it for me, because I remember what my father said to me. The second thing my dad said is be capable. Don't be afraid to say I don't know if somebody asks you a question. And then find out and get back to them. He said, then 2 of you will know. The third thing he said was be a team player. Whenever I went on a base where I had to do a project, I would go through the protocol, because I had a letter of introduction from my commanding general. I go through the protocol, commander, vice commander, chief of staff, and then I said, I want to talk to your top sergeant. And he and I would have lunch, either in the mess hall, or dinner in the mess hall, or the NCO club. I would lay out the project and say, there's no way I'm going to do this alone. I've got to have your help. That's how I got my team together. And the last thing that my father said to me, and he wanted me to be very careful about how I phrased it. If you give respect, you get respect. And I found that really works. Even for the littlest cadets that we have in Civil Air Patrol. It's amazing. If you treat them with respect, you'd be surprised what you get back. So basically what I do all the time, most of the time, is I fly all over the country going to the various wings and to squadrons. Kids invite me because I pay my own expenses, and I'm going up to Alaska for my 5th trip, where I get to fly the Beaver up there. So that's always a pleasure, but I do like the youngsters up there. And this is what I do. And somebody asked me where I go on vacation. I said I go to Sentimental Journey up at Piper. But most of the time I get to fly everywhere, and I really have a good time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions you might want to ask me, please let me know. Thank you.
I just want to say that so many members of our club started their careers in World War II and had their lives disrupted. And as you did, Mary, facing the challenge during those turbulent times, you used that opportunity to really promote women in the professional workplace as well as promoting aviation. So whether it's the post office in Washington or Rimbaud-Hazy or the Smithsonian or the Piper Museum, we'll think of you and all the wonderful things that you've done to promote history as well as contribution to the World War II effort. I would like to just add that Mary she's been invited to the gathering of Mustangs and Legends in Columbus at the Rickenbacker Field at the end of September with a number of distinguished P-51 pilots and 100 aircraft. You'll be appearing up at the Piper Museum.
Thank you.
And also, Mary has asked that money for the trip, she came all the way from Annapolis to be with us tonight, is staying overnight, and has asked the money be used maybe for some project for a young member of the World War II Roundtable, if we can do something for them to promote their interest. So, Mary, thank you. You can continue to contribute, and we're very honored and appreciative that you came up here. Thank you.
Were there any questions for Mary? Yes.
Did you meet Kelly Johnson?
Did you meet Kelly?
Johnson?
Oh, absolutely. Scotland? Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
He came to the Garden facility at one time. He was not very well, but he came to come to the airplane. And he was very, very grateful.
Mary, our videographer wants you to use the mic. Our videographer wants you to use the mic.
Okay. All right, Mike. Yes, this man measured up in my esteem in every way. I knew him during the Skunk Works era, and then later when he came. And I know that he was looking at the U-2, which we had, and you could just tell he was melting just looking at this airplane. Yes, I did have a chance to meet him, and I was very happy to have that opportunity. And there.
Well, in 1938, out of, was it Greenland? Did you have anything to do with the restoration of that?
The P-38, where?
It was in the ice.
Oh, no, you mean Glacier Girl?
Yeah.
No, I didn't have anything to do with that particular thing, but I did see it down at Sun and Fun 2 years ago, and I just can't believe what they were able to do with that airplane, stinging it out of the glacier. But I also found out, too, that the insurance that they require to fly that airplane will probably keep it on the ground, which is the unfortunate part of all of it. But at Sun's Fun, they did fly a lot, and it is magnificent. There's no question. And I'm just happy that somebody decided that that would be a way to go. That was a monumental effort, and very, very costly. But you'll get to see it maybe in some flying somewhere. But if not, I'm hoping you'll be in a position where other people can look at it. It is magnificent. Yeah.
Two questions. Did you meet or have a chance to talk with Charles Lindbergh and Dick Baum? And so what are your impressions of these?
No, I didn't meet Charles Lindbergh, but Richard Bond also flew from base ops at Wright Field. And I knew him, I talked to him because he obviously knew how to fly the P-80 for one thing. But I also was on the team when he was killed. I was on the investigative team because I knew the airplane, and that was probably the saddest thing. But that man was probably the most understated, unassuming man I've ever met. But boy, he could really fly. And he was very, very gentle, very much of a gentleman.
Was this plane a plane out, or did it melt the tail like you
No, we were not really sure. The way he entered in, the engine pushed him down into a hole, actually. Now, whether he flew too fast and went to a stall, that could have been, because it was very easy to think of a jet airplane that could go to the speed of sound. Now, if he were pushing it to that level, and then he went into a compression stall, then he could have gone in. And basically, that's what we feel with the impact. That was what we felt happened. Sadly, very sad. Yes.
Jack Rowland, in one of his books, talked about that there were problems in the dive with the P-80A. Do you have any as far as there would be some problem as far as damage to it? That's why they really pushed the P-80C. Do you have any insight into that?
Not that I recall, even though my P Captain Bear was one of the early P-80s. But it was an airplane. It was very tricky to fly simply because if you did not arrange to go around early, say once you missed your approach, if you jammed the throttle for you got the flame out. You didn't have the spooling up time that the airplane required. And we lost a lot of men that just simply autoed in, so jammed the throttle, flame out, too low to recover, and just crash. So that was part of what I had to do in my particular captive air, was to say, when you start up and you miss your approach, you better be sure you allow enough time for your spooling up. You don't jam the throttle. So we used to make them jam the throttle forward just to get the experience of a flame out. And it was really an eye-opener for most of them. Because in the P-50, when you jam the throttle, you're in the back, your head is in the back seat practically. So that was one of the things we had. It was a very, very important thing, is pulling up time. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Mary, I have a little story for you. A number of years ago, I was in a group that was privileged to go out to Silver Hill and got through some of the warehouses. And we came to where they had the Enola Gay store. And I asked our guide, I said, can I go up and touch that airplane? And he said, yes, you can. And I went up and I kissed it. And as I did, a group of Japanese tourists came in behind us. It was rather interesting to see the looks of their faces.
One of the problems that those of us that have lived through all of this, we have historian revisionists. And I remember when I was at Silver Hill, and I was starting to work on the cockpit of the Enola Gay before the SPAD came up. we had some teenagers from high school from Japan, and they looked at the Enola Gay, and they said that they bombed Pearl Harbor because we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. That's what they were being taught. Now, I've lived through an awful lot of history, being there, done that sort of thing, and it does give me a bit of a heartache, if you will, to hear the history being revised when you know you were there and you know it isn't right. So I can imagine that they really had.
They were a bit taken aback. Well, thank you again, Mary, and let's give this lady another hand. I'm going to have to make one announcement. The Keystone chapter of the Association of the United States Army is meeting Wednesday, September 19th, in the ballroom at the Community Club at Fort Indian Town Gap. And any of you who have been out to that community club know they have the large painting that covers one whole end of the building of the Indians, and way up in the one corner is Donald Duck. How he fit into that, I'm not sure. But anyway, Mr. Frank Borth, who's now 89 years old, who painted that, is going to be there and be their speaker that night, and the public is invited to attend. So if you get a chance to go out there, get to meet the man that painted that. And I met him once before. He told me, he said, boy, I took as long as I could to make that painting because it meant I was going to stay at Indian Town Gap. Anyway, he will be there, as I say, Wednesday, September 19th at 1800 hours, as they say in the AUSA, with dinner at 1900 hours. So it's an open invitation from the president of the Keystone Chapter AUSA. And the only other thing is, as you newcomers probably don't know, what's he doing running around with that steel pot? We do not have dues, and instead of passing the hat, we pass a World War II steel pot. Thank you all for coming.